This is Democracy Here. My name is Mary Malmros. Today, my guest is Max Page. We'll be discussing topics such as Raise Up Massachusetts, the upcoming ballot question on the Fair Share Amendment, and topics of interest to members of Franklin County continuing the political revolution.
Good worker, good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on?
So, Max, let me start by asking you about Raise Up Massachusetts. It's not an organization I'm very familiar with. Can you tell me a little about it? How did it start, and what's its central goals?
Sure. So Raise Up Massachusetts is an organization of almost 200, it's a coalition of almost 200 organizations, unions, faith-based groups, community organizations across the state who want to build a more economically and racially just Commonwealth. And it started a number of years ago as a way of advancing a series of legal changes to improve the Commonwealth. And so one of the first things that the coalition won was universal sick leave for every worker, access to sick leave for every worker. Believe it or not, until just a few years ago, until a ballot initiative a few years ago, there was no right to take a day off because you're sick. You could lose your job, you would lose your pay for more than 1 million workers. And so the Raise Up Mass Coalition came together, put forward a ballot initiative, and it was voted on by the voters and passed by them.
And that was your first initiative?
That was the first initiative, successful, overwhelmingly successful. The next initiative was raising the minimum wage. So our minimum wage was at $8, not that much more above the federal minimum wage of $7.25. And again, the Raise Up Mass Coalition agreed on moving it up to $11, $1 a year. So over 3 years, it would go from being $8 to $11 minimum wage. And what happened there was interesting was that though Raise Up to develop a ballot initiative so that all the voters would vote on it, ultimately the legislature voted to raise the minimum wage to $11, and there was no need for a ballot initiative, and beat us to it, which is exactly what we were hoping for.
Now that's interesting. That's an interesting dynamic then, that you start moving by initiative petition and then the legislature responds. Do you see that on other issues too?
Absolutely, and this has become a strategy, frankly, to pressure the legislature to do what it otherwise won't do. We have, we think of ourselves as a very progressive state, but in fact on a lot of things we move very slowly. So what the strategy of Raise Up Massachusetts has been is to file legislation and try to move it that way, but also to say, look, if the legislature isn't going to move forward on these progressive initiatives, then we'll take it to the voters because we think the voters will approve them. And so far, that's been the case.
So specific to that, coming up on the ballot in 2018, you have the Fair Share Amendment. Can you tell me more about that, its history and its current status?
Sure, and I should say that Raise Up is an incredibly democratic organization. So when we talk about Fair Share and maybe the other initiatives, those came out of a grassroots process where all these different groups that are part of Raise Up talked about what are the priorities, what should we pursue next. And one of the things at the very top of the agenda was progressive taxes, and that's what the Fair Share Amendment is. So it's a little bit complicated because in Massachusetts, in our Constitution, we have a flat tax. In other words, we're like one of those more right-wing states. Only 15 states, I believe, have a flat tax built into their Constitution.
Is that a very old historical thing?
Well, we have the oldest Constitution in the United States. It's the model for the federal Constitution. So ours is 1780, and it set the notion of that there is one tax rate that is used. So we all pay 5.1%, whether you're a millionaire, whether you make $20,000. Other states are more like the federal taxes, where the more you make, the more you're supposed to percentage you're supposed to take. So to get progressive taxes built in, we have to go to change the Constitution. So that is quite a feat. You know, understandably, the idea is you don't want to just change the Constitution willy-nilly. So what Raise Up did was had to gather signatures, and as if you were doing a ballot initiative. So that's about 70,000 signatures from citizens of Massachusetts. To be sure you get valid signatures, we actually collected 150,000 signatures. What that did is it put that before the legislature and said, okay, the people want you to deal with this constitutional amendment.
Right.
The legislature then voted in favor of that constitutional amendment, and they did it the following year. You have to pass it by the legislature twice, 2 consecutive years, and then once you do that, then it goes to the voters. So we're at the final stage where the voters in November, if they approve of this amendment, it'll change our Constitution in order to allow for one additional tax gradation. And it's a very, very progressive tax gradation. In other words, it only applies to people who have more than $1 million in income per year. Now, I don't know if that hits you, Mary, but it doesn't hit me, and it doesn't hit anyone I know. But it hits about 13,000 to 14,000 people in Massachusetts,
Really?
which is tiny for the in a state of 6.5 million. But that just shows how many wealthy people live in Massachusetts.
Sure.
So just people making over $1 million a year will be taxed an additional 4% just on the money above $1 million. The first $1 million is free. It's the charge at the regular rate.
Right.
Only
Same rate
money
as the rest of us.
Yeah, but the money above $1 million. So if you make $1 million and $1 a year,
Then the $1.
gets charged an additional 4 cents.
I see.
Instead of paying 5 cents, you'll pay 9 cents on
I
that
see.
additional
Okay.
dollar. But the amazing thing is how much money this will generate. So just taxing the money above $1 million, an additional 4%, and it's really only on 13,000 or 14,000 families, generates up to $2 billion a year. That means we're talking about millionaires and billionaires who would pay a tiny bit more in order to generate this money.
And so then what does this money get spent for?
Well, so that's a great question, because in the past, there have been various proposals to create a graduated income tax in Massachusetts, and frankly, they've all failed. And one of the main reasons they failed is that I think people think, well, we'll give money to the legislature, and that's
it's
just a
gonna go into the
big
general fund and-
sinkhole.
right.
It's just, who knows what happens to it. This constitutional amendment is written so that the money is dedicated to public education, pre-K through higher ed. Secondly, to making public higher education more affordable. And third, to the repair and maintenance of roads, bridges, and public transportation. So those are 3 of the most important kind of public investments that we can make.
I see.
And it's saying that this $2 billion is to be in addition to whatever else the legislature is spending on these issues.
Right.
And it's designed to lead to a major reinvestment in these essential public functions.
So if this is not going to affect me, but if it did, if I did have over $1 million in income, would I not just pick up and move to another state where this is not the case? Great
question. So that's going to be one of the main arguments of the opposition, and the good news is the answer is no. What I always love is when there's an argument by the opponents. They make an argument and they feel very crafty that they've made an argument. But in fact, we can look at other states where this has happened. So California raised its income tax for wealthy people. Minnesota did the same thing. And it turns out millionaires and billionaires are less mobile than other people, which doesn't make sense. They're like, why wouldn't you just pick up and move to Florida where there's no income tax? It turns out, though, when you think about it, it makes sense. Millionaires and billionaires have built mansions. They're on boards of museums and hospitals. They're like much more actually invested and revered. Whether or not they should be revered is another question, but they're kind of settled into those communities.
Sure.
So a Stanford University professor recently did a study about this and found that millionaires do not move when taxes are raised on them. Because the truth is, this is actually going to be, this is like money, change falling out of their back pocket, the amount of money that those millionaires and billionaires will be paying in taxes, but it means a lot to our public schools and colleges.
Can you quantify that in terms of what kind of programs, what would actually be purchased with that money? You said what categories.
Yeah.
But as an example, what could we do with the anticipated revenue in terms of, say, K through 12?
Well, so this is the beautiful thing, is that for years, ever since I came to UMass in 2001, the only conversation is, what are we going to cut next year? What are we gonna skimp on? And then I'm a father of 3 kids in the Amherst Public Schools.
And it's the
what are
same
we cutting?
thing there.
It's always like, what are we gonna cut?
Right.
In the wealthiest
What can the
state
parents
in the
contribute? What can the teachers bring out of their own pockets?
Exactly.
Right?
So part of the excitement is and part of the campaign is to have these conversations in communities across the Commonwealth. What would we do if we had another $2 billion for our schools, our colleges, our roads and bridges and public transportation? So that's ongoing, and that's part of the campaign. Look, we could provide more educators in classrooms. Maybe we could have smaller classrooms. We could provide the actual services that our special needs kids need. We could make public higher education debt-free for our students.
Yeah.
So what I find so amazing about this campaign is that it's allowing us to dream again. And not just dream, not just fantasize, but actually dream about something that could become reality in just a few months.
So now that makes me think of something specific to Massachusetts, which is very much dependent on a knowledge economy and on a highly trained workforce. Is that an angle that you've exploited with industry leaders? In other words, saying to them, if we can make this happen, we know that so many students come to Massachusetts to attend institutions of higher learning, and then they like to stay here, they like it here.
Right.
If they could be debt-free, is that an angle that you use to gain support among industry?
Absolutely. Look, why is it that GE moved from Connecticut to Massachusetts, knowing that this tax was coming down the pike and was very popular? They said it didn't bother them at all because they want to be in the Massachusetts knowledge economy. But we're not producing enough college-educated students for the future industries. So we actually have a number of business leaders who are supportive of this effort.
Tech industry, mostly?
Tech industry and other wealthy people who feel like this makes sense.
This is an investment in the future.
Right, exactly. And it's especially actually for public higher education because 80% or more of our public school graduates, public college and university graduates, stay in the Commonwealth.
Right.
The truth is most of the Harvard, MIT, et cetera, the private universities, those students actually, most of them leave, go other places. So the best investment for the long-term future of Massachusetts is public education, pre-K through higher ed.
So I'm curious about something because you started working on this years ago. This has been years in the making, obviously. Before Donald Trump was elected, before the Republican Congress put forth their tax bill, which passed last fall. And that tax bill hits people from Massachusetts and other states with a state income tax especially hard because our taxes are no longer deductible. Is there any equalizing factor, or does this help with that in any way?
Well,
or is that too many levels of indirection?
No. I think there's a larger frame of all the negative things that the Trump administration is doing and what they would love to do in terms of cutting federal programs. In other words, for instance, what we spend on mass health, our Medicaid program is an enormous part of our budget. And we depend on the federal government to fund a lot of that. If they cut back on that, then perhaps some of the money that's being raised through fair share will end up being moved over to cover that. So that's the real danger.
Sure.
So we're hoping that doesn't happen. There's also a very disturbing ballot initiative to lower the sales tax in Massachusetts that will be on the ballot in November. That would basically cut in half the amount of money we would raise. In other words, we'd raise $2 billion from the fair share, but then we'd lose $1 billion because of the sales tax going down. So there's a lot of discussions about how to either defeat it at the ballot or get that off the ballot altogether.
Yeah. So November's coming sooner than we think. How does it look?
The fair share amendment, let's see, it's always bad to make predictions, but I feel like it's been popular, it is popular, people understand it as necessary investments by asking the wealthiest people in Massachusetts, which are some of the wealthiest people in the nation, to pay a little bit more. So I think it will pass. It benefits every community, so there will be great organizing going on, including in Franklin County by CPR, in order to pass this. So I feel optimistic it will pass.
And how can organizers help?
Well, organizers should definitely go to Raise Up
website.
Mass and sign up to be involved in community meetings that are happening. And then as the summer goes along, we're going to really get down to knocking on doors and making calls. On May 8th, there's a big Raise Up Mass Congress at the State House to talk about fair share, as well as to talk about some of the other initiatives we're involved in.
I'll have to find out more about that. That sounds very interesting. Can I ask about some of the other work that you're doing? I know
Sure.
that you're involved, for example, in the Fight for 15 and also in paid family medical leave.
Exactly, yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about what's going on with those and how they dovetail with the other initiatives and the organization's goals?
Sure. So Raise Up Mass, one of the things that I think makes it such a strong coalition is that it is a built-to-last coalition. In other words, it's not like we're going to develop a coalition to pass this one bill and then we all go our separate ways.
Right.
The idea is to step-by-step improve the Commonwealth and make it a more equitable place. So this grassroots group of 200 organizations decided on 3 issues several years ago that we would pursue.
Right.
One was fair share. The next 2 is $15 minimum wage, raising the minimum wage again from 11 to 15 by going up $1 a year until we get to $15. And then the second one is the paid family and medical leave.
Right.
That is 87% of workers in Massachusetts do not have access to paid family or medical leave. Right? It's incredible. It's 1.2 million people would lose their job or lose pay if they said, I had a baby, I need to go take care of them. They're officially allowed to take the leave by the federal act, but they can't actually take it because they won't
can't
get paid.
afford it, right.
And for many others, if you say, well, I'm taking care of my elderly parent who's critically ill, that's not allowed, and they could lose their job and certainly would lose their pay.
Now, how does that, can I ask just, how
Sure.
does that, the nuts and bolts of that?
Sure.
If somebody has, for example, paid vacation time, most private sector workers, if they need to take time off for sickness or for personal matters, that has to come out of their vacation time. Does this affect that at all?
Right. It doesn't affect that, but there's a million workers who, if
Don't
you're working
have
at McDonald's,
any.
you're not
Right.
getting sick leave, you're not getting vacation time,
Right.
and you're not getting a living wage.
So what does this prescribe then for every worker?
Well, so what it would do is essentially create a insurance pool. So employers, and maybe employers and employees would chip in to a kind of a fund. And everyone would chip in a tiny bit, a couple dollars a week, would chip into a fund. And then when you need it for your own, to take care of yourself because you've had a major medical issue, when you had a child or adopted a child, or are taking care of another family member, you would
draw from
you
the
would
fund.
draw on from the fund.
Right.
If you don't need it, you don't draw from it. But when you do need it, you could draw from it. And it is designed to provide the most pay replacement to the lowest wage workers. So in
I
other
see.
words, the lowest wage workers would get maybe 90%
Right.
of their pay for up to 26 weeks
Right.
for themselves if they're ill. And then people further who make a little bit more might get a little bit lower percentage. They probably have some savings. So it's a very progressive plan, and it covers some of our lowest wage workers.
Most vulnerable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with $15 minimum wage. That is a majority of people who make the minimum wage now are women, often single mothers, people of color. And so raising it from $11 to $15 over 4 years would lift over 1 million people out of poverty.
Sure.
So that's incredible. And that also shows how, even in this very wealthy state, we have that million is below the poverty line. So this is a very, very important way to make a more just Commonwealth.
Sure. Now, I had a conversation with a restaurant owner a few months ago. I'm sure you know what I'm going to say. Actually,
I do. It's fair enough. No,
he had an interesting spin on it. He said, I don't necessarily object to paying my lowest paid workers $15, but I can't afford to bump everybody. So if I raise them, there are people that are going to want more as well.
Right.
How do they handle that? What's your advice for them?
So, I think I respect and sympathize with the worry. I mean, and with small businesses, they're operating on small margins. But we had these legitimate fears when we went from 8 to 11. The very same arguments were made, and I, again, was sympathetic and understanding. And yet, what we saw is businesses did not close. Unemployment went down, actually. We have a healthy economy. If you move things up slowly and steadily, and it's expected over several years, tiny adjustments in prices, for instance, in a restaurant, more than make up for that pay. And I think the same thing is shown will happen here from 11 to 15, and we see it all over the country. Aaron Dubé is a professor at UMass Amherst in economics, has been looking at minimum wage laws and the impact all over the country. And what we find is that the greatest fears, and even if they're legitimate, sometimes they're illegitimate arguments against it, but those are legitimate small businesses having fears, they turn out not to be borne out. That in fact, ultimately, you have more people with a little more money in their pockets, and low-income people, even at, and you will still be low-income at $15 in minimum wage, spend most of their money in their communities. So that's what I think it'll actually be good for the economy.
So, okay, so that's legitimate concerns. What about the bad faith concerns, the false concerns? How do we answer them, and how do we show them for what they are?
Well, so this is why having the experience of having just done it, because I've had my discussions with some people I feel like don't have such good faith, and I say, look, we have experience in other states where this has happened. We have our own experience we just went through, and you can't find the negative impacts, or at least any kind of disastrous impacts, and mostly it's positive impacts. So I feel like getting the message out about the impacts, but I also think there's a larger message, which is how can we have a system, a business system, in which we need to pay workers poverty wages in order to survive. If we want to help small businesses, and I respect the need that they're under pressure, there are other ways the state could support them. It shouldn't be on suppressing worker wages in order to achieve a decently profitable company.
Sure, absolutely. So we're getting close to the end. I just have a question about your member organizations or the members of the coalition. How does somebody find out? On your website, what are the different organizations that are members of Raise Up? And how do they initiate actions through Raise Up?
Sure. So yes, you can see all the organizations on there, and other organizations. Actually, I don't know if CPR is a member, but or small organizations, community organizations, faith-based groups, labor unions, all can join up and be partners. And there are regular grassroots meetings, which means all those groups are invited to participate. And in fact, when we chose these latest issues, there was actually a vote taken by the member organizations.
I see.
And the bar is low to get in. You have to believe in the principles of Raise Up, commit to doing some work and contributing. You know, smaller organizations can't contribute money, but they can contribute time and people power, and to commit to working on the issues that the group supports. So in this case, everyone who's in Raise Up is on board with the 3 issues that we're fighting for right now.
And what's the current status as far as being on the ballot for Fight for 15 for a paid family medical leave? Are they on?
Yeah, so it's complicated. So the Fair Share Amendment is on the ballot, and is ready to be voted on, and that's the only way for it to get through. Voting in November. Paid family medical leave at $15 are sitting in the legislature. Whenever you get signatures for a ballot initiative, they are put forward to the legislature, and the legislature could pass them. So they are debating them, and there's discussions about how to pass them, and we think they should just pass them this spring before they go on vacation at the end of July, and then we would take it off the ballot. So they are ready to go on the ballot, they're ready to be printed, but there's a certain deadline by which before which you can remove a ballot initiative. And that's what happened with the $11 minimum wage. It was ready to go on the ballot. The legislature passed it just in time, and we pulled it back.
Do you think that will happen in this case?
I hope so. I do think that there's a lot of will. Frankly, the governor has said, come on, folks, work this out, and the legislative leaders, and we are fine with having it work out as long as it does not compromise these ballot initiatives. So there's discussions going on, but we're very firm that these are popular, these are good, and that we're not going to compromise on giving in on these basic issues. So
summer's the deadline.
It's actually probably before the end of the session. I think it's maybe June is at which point they gets on the ballot and you can't change it.
Okay. And then back to the Fair Share Amendment, this being an amendment. If it passes by popular vote in November, when would it take effect?
It would take effect January 1, meaning the new tax rates would take effect then. But that means it would take a little while. It would take a year before the money starts flowing in. And so is an important point that you bring up, because we want to win, and we want to win by a lot. Because we want to go back to the legislature and say, here's the overwhelming will of the people. And through our conversations in the campaign, we want you to spend the money on X, Y, and Z.
I see.
Because the truth is, the legislature, by our Constitution, is the only body that can dedicate the money to a particular thing.
I see.
We can say it has to go to education in the Constitution, but they get to decide, it goes to busing, or it goes to special needs kids, or
Right.
wherever. So we want to be prepared as a coalition to go in and say, here's our agenda for how the money gets spent.
So do you see that as being an ongoing process, assuming it passes, assuming there's an amendment? You've said, generally speaking, infrastructure and education. But do you see Raise Up taking a role in an ongoing way of deciding what are the priorities right now?
Absolutely. The beauty of democracy is it never ends. In other words, they could allocate the money in the first year, and then they could change their mind next year. And that's why having the Raise Up Mass Coalition be, as I said, built to last, built on firm ground with a large number of groups, is important, because we're going to be needing to fight for that allocation ongoing, and then we're going to have new issues we're going to want to raise.
Tell me about new issues then.
Well, nothing's been decided. I think what happens is, once this cycle is over, and hopefully we've won all three of these, then a process begins by which we talk about, all right, what's next? What's the things next on the agenda? Frankly, fair share amendment is as wonderful as it is. It's not going to be enough money to build the Commonwealth we want. We cut taxes in this Commonwealth $3.5 billion. That means $3.5 billion yearly is out of the budget. So we're only going to get a little over halfway back with the fair share amendment. So
I see.
There are probably other proposals for raising revenue in the future.
And what sort of proposals might there be as far as raising revenues? We've talked about taxes, but something having to do with corporate taxes or changing priorities? Or?
Well, there's different kinds of taxes one could do. There's personally, I think, we have some of the very wealthiest institutions here, and maybe they need to contribute a little bit more. I mean, Harvard has a larger endowment than our state budget, a yearly state budget. It's close to $38 billion. Is it fair to ask that they support the Commonwealth that makes them able to succeed? And not just Harvard, there's lots of very wealthy endowed institutions. That's
a heavy lift.
It's a heavy lift, it is. But these are conversations that need to happen.
Okay. So it's a very busy year coming up.
It is, it's very busy. There's a lot that will happen in the next couple of months in the legislature to see whether those two issues, $15 minimum wage and paid family medical leave, can be passed satisfactorily and then not have to be on the ballot. But we're prepared to take it all the way to the ballot because we think they're both very popular, as well as fair share.
So in just the few seconds that we have left, tell me a little bit more about what's happening on May 8th.
Sure. So May 8th is a Congress, they call it the Raise Up Massachusetts Congress, and it's actually focused on those two initiatives that could be decided in the legislature, $15 and the paid family medical leave.
And how would people participate?
People would show up. It's 12 to 4 at the State House. I can't remember which room, but no doubt we're hoping to have 1,000 people there. So just listen for the cheers. And the idea is to have presentations and not just presentations from economists, but have individuals who will be affected by paid family medical leave and raising the minimum wage talk about their experience now and what life would be like afterwards. So it's going to be a very exciting day.
That sounds great. Well, thank you very much. And that's it for Democracy Here.
Sisters, which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? My father was a carpenter, now he's with the air and sun. But he'll be with his fellow workers till the battle's won. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? They say in Milwaukee, cleansed by Great Lake water, you'll either be a Union man or a thug or Skywalker. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my